Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere FBI agents break down your front door, throw in a flashbang grenade, drag you out in handcuffs, and then hold your wife at gunpoint. All because they actually got the wrong house. Now, here's the kicker. When you tried to hold the government accountable for that mistake, they argue that you can't sue them. Now, that's the exact situation that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court handed down a 9-0 unanimous ruling that could have major implications not just for this family, but also gun owners who are concerned about these types of government actions. So, let's talk about what happened in this critical ruling and what happens now in this case going forward. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to simply subscribe to the channel. That of course helps the channel to grow. And I also want to mention, just double check to make sure YouTube has not unsubscribed you, because they love to do that, especially on these types of channels. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a recent 9-0 unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court, which all gun owners should actually be aware of. This case is called Martin versus the United States, and it comes out of a suburban Atlanta area where back in 2017, the FBI executed a pre-dawn raid. But the only problem was that they went to the wrong house, and they got the wrong address. The family inside that home sued the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. Now, the question that the court had to address was, does the federal government get to walk away from liability, or can someone sue them and hold them accountable in the same way that a private person would be held accountable if they made the same mistake? At its core, this case isn't about the Second Amendment or gun rights directly, but it's one case that every gun owner should actually know about. And the question is, why should you be aware of this? Well, because this deals with government accountability, wrongful raids, and whether the federal government can be held responsible when agents go too far or make a reckless mistake. And now the Supreme Court's 9-0 ruling has overruled the lower court's decision in this case, and they have sent the case back down to the lower court for re-review. However, the DOJ was just able to stall this case temporarily. But still, this is moving in the right direction, and the Supreme Court came to a proper decision. Now, here's what happened in this case. Essentially, FBI Special Agent Lawrence Guerrero was tasked with leading a pre-dawn raid at a home where suspected gang members were believed to be hiding. The target address was a specific address, but instead of going there directly, the FBI agent here decided to use his own personal GPS, I believe his phone. He put the address in his phone, and it routed him to a completely different home. It actually took him to the home of the plaintiffs here, Katrina Martin, where she lived there with her boyfriend and also her 7-year-old son. Now, when the FBI agents arrived at the home without warning, they decided to smash in the front door. They threw in flashbang grenades. They pulled out her boyfriend, who was hiding, I believe, in fear, in the closet. Unfortunately, he was hiding when this was happening. So they pulled him out. They pulled Katrina Martin out. Also, they handcuffed him. They held Katrina Martin at gunpoint, and they pulled their 7-year-old son out as well. Now, after they were all arrested, the FBI agents did a search of the home. And when searching the home, they saw that there was some, mail on a coffee table. And one of the agents looked at the mail and noticed that it had a completely different address. And at that time, they kind of had this huge, oh crap moment. We're at the wrong home. Now, in response to this, the family sued the FBI for the wrongful raid. And they brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA, which is a law that allows ordinary people to sue the federal government for certain wrongful acts by federal employees when those employees are acting in the scope of their own job. Now, normally the federal government would be shielded, and these officers would be shielded with immunities like qualified immunity. But the FTCA is one of those situations where the government has carved out certain situations where you can bring these claims against them in courts. But the FTCA also comes with a long list of exceptions where you cannot bring these suits. Now, two of those exceptions were brought up by the FBI in defense. The first exception is called the intentional tort exception. And normally you can't, under the FTC, bring this type of lawsuit in to sue the government for intentional wrongs when the assault, battery, or false arrest or malicious prosecution is tied to these types of government acts. Now, right after that, there are some carve-outs and exceptions called the law enforcement proviso. And that proviso says that if the wrongdoing is committed by a federal law enforcement officer, someone empowered to execute searches and seize evidence or make arrests, you can still potentially bring those types of intentional tort claims against them. Now, the second type of exception that was brought up by the FBI is called the discretionary function exception. And that exception shields the government from the wrongful acts that stem from an official making a discretionary decision. Meaning that if they make a discretionary, choice under their employment, title or whatever they're doing, well, then potentially they fall under that exception. Now, the idea here in this case was that since this FBI agent used his discretion to put the address in his own personal GPS, they claimed that he fell under that discretionary exception. Now, when the family filed their lawsuit, the Federal District Court in Georgia reviewed this case, and essentially the government also here the FBI moved to dismiss this challenge under those exceptions, and ultimately the lower court ruled in the FBI's favor. The case was then appealed up to the 11th Circuit, and on review the 11th Circuit also ruled in favor of the FBI and the agents here with their actions. As a result of those two rulings by the lower courts, this was then sought for Supreme Court review. A cert petition was filed and ultimately it was granted, reviewed and then ruled on by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the family. So they ruled against the FBI. The Supreme Court in that unanimous ruling written then by Justice Neil Gorsuch. They ultimately vacated what the 11th Circuit said in their ruling and then sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit for re-re. The Supreme Court held first that the law enforcement proviso only modifies the intentional tort exception. It does not override all the other exceptions that are mentioned in the FTCA. Now, that may be a kind of technical point here that happened in this ruling, but it matters because the lower courts have been applying some sort of broad immunity. And that's also what was applied by the lower court. The Supreme Court found that the government is not automatically immune just because an officer's actions are tied to federal policy or could be characterized as consistent with the federal laws. That's not how the FTCA was meant to work. Instead, liability under the FTCA is judged by state laws. So, the statute says that the government could be liable if, under similar circumstances, a private person would be liable under that law of the state. So essentially, it's trying to look at the actions of the federal government and, weigh that also to how a private person would be treated under those state laws. Based on that, the Supreme Court vacated the 11th Circuit's decision and remanded for further consideration in light of that new 9-0 ruling. Now, recently the 11th Circuit ordered that the FBI, the federal government here, needs to file a supplemental brief and outline how the Supreme Court's new ruling impacts this case going forward, but the DOJ was able to get an extension on having to file that response until November 21st that could be pushed out further as well because here the FBI and the federal government are arguing that the federal shutdown currently prevents their attorneys from working on their behalf in filing the brief that the court is requesting. But regardless, eventually the federal government, the FBI will have to respond to this, new case, this case moving forward in light of what the Supreme Court said. They're only going to be able to stall it out for a period of time while the shutdown is happening. We've already seen some other courts actually eventually order that the attorneys there for the federal government have to file despite the shutdown. So we'll see how that plays out as well. Maybe the court here will push them to do that. We've seen some other courts order those still be filed despite the shutdown. But as of right now, the court here has given them at least until November 21st. Now, you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with gun owners? Well, here's why this is so important. If the federal government is able to hide behind this type of broad discretion definition every single time that they make a huge mistake, that is not accountability. But here, this Supreme Court ruling in this Martin case narrows the government's ability to avoid these types of lawsuits by claiming this type of broad immunity. It reinforces that federal agents can be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home or misuse their powers.